If you've been listening to me through the 6+ months of this horror as it's played out in the Middle East, you'll know that in most instances I can see the Israeli side. If you've listened for any time, you'll know that I've referenced, and I always make a point of saying this, that I'm privileged to serve on the board of CST, which is a Jewish charity protecting Jewish people in this country. I've also had the privilege of attending many Jewish functions, dinners, and I've been handed various awards down the years. I've also been facilitated a trip to Israel, so I suppose, in a way, certainly I will always be a friend of Jewish people in this country, as I would do the same if there was a Muslim organisation to organise similar events. I would take part. So certainly I'm a friend of Jewish people, which I suppose makes me a friend of Israel. And sometimes it takes a friend to tell a friend where they're going wrong. And that is this moment. This is indefensible. I've made a point of actually getting in a little earlier than usual to read as much as I possibly can about the events that led to the death of these 7 aid workers. And every single fact is horrific. Not least the vehicles, as I think you probably all know because you'll have seen in newspaper photographs or on TV. They're all clearly displayed as carrying aid workers. They have the various emblems and everything else. Did you know they're also operating on routes that are approved by the Israeli Defense Forces? So these are routes that they know these vehicles go down to facilitate aid getting into Gaza. So they're clearly marked vehicles on pre-designated routes, and supposedly we're told the precision of the Israeli military, which we're meant to believe is one of the greatest on earth, with 3 separate strikes, with time apart from them, authorised, again, I read, but it needs a senior military figure, it needs a military lawyer, whatever that is, it needs an area commander, and still this went ahead? So, from one friend to another, this has to stop. And I would suggest that at the very least, when you consider that it is possible, I don't know anything about drone missiles, but presumably it's possible, the missiles that we sell to Israel have just killed 3 of our own citizens, along with 4 other innocent workers, all of the Britons, I understand, who've served in the military, some with a degree of distinction, and it could have been our own missiles that killed them? I would suggest now is the time that we temporarily suspend the sale of arms to Israel, because some message has to get through. Now, the condemnation was swift. Yesterday we played you the reaction of Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Later, yesterday morning, we heard from our own Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Shocked and saddened to hear the reported deaths of aid workers in Gaza. We're urgently working to confirm all the details, but my thoughts right now with their friends and family. They're doing fantastic work, bringing alleviation to the suffering that many are experiencing in Gaza. They should be praised and commended for what they're doing. They need to be allowed to do that work unhindered, and it's incumbent on Israel to make sure that they can do that, and we're asking Israel to investigate what happened urgently, because clearly there are questions that need to be answered.
Later in the day, Rishi Sunak had a call with his Israeli counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu after the deaths, in which he went further, saying the situation in Gaza is increasingly intolerable and warned Israel was at risk of allowing a humanitarian catastrophe in the area. Then at a press conference in Paris as part of a visit to Europe, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said America would also be demanding answers from Israel over the tragedy, and he paid tribute to those who lost their lives in Monday night's strike.
The victims of yesterday's strike join a record number of humanitarian workers who've been killed in this particular conflict. These people are heroes. They run into the fire, not away from it. They show the best of what humanity has to offer when the going really gets tough. They have to be protected. We shouldn't have a situation where people who are simply trying to help their fellow human beings are themselves at grave risk.
Overnight, US President Joe Biden spoke of his outrage over the incident. We've heard briefly from the Prime Minister Netanyahu in response to the incident. While he acknowledged Israel's responsibility for the deaths of those aid workers, he stopped short of an apology.
Unfortunately, in the past day there was a tragic event in which our forces unintentionally harmed non-combatants in the Gaza Strip. This happens in the war. We are conducting a thorough inquiry and we are in contact with the governments. We will do everything to prevent a recurrence.
It's interesting now that it would seem some Israelis have had enough. Prime Minister Netanyahu's faced days of protests outside his home in Jerusalem. Last night, the scenes became chaotic, police admitting the demonstration turned into a riot. Police were called to restore order. Let's go first to Greg Karlstrom, who's Middle East correspondent for The Economist, joining me from Dubai, but you've been in many of these battle zones and areas. Just what level of risk do these aid workers put themselves in your view, Greg? Good morning.
Hi, good morning. It's a tremendous level of risk, not only in Gaza, but in conflict zones across the region. It's not supposed to be so risky in Gaza on paper because there is meant to be this coordination mechanism whereby aid workers alert the Israeli army to where they're planning to go, what roads they're going to take, what vehicles they're in. But that mechanism has not worked over the past 6 months. There have been other incidents, even before this one, where convoys of aid workers have been fired on by Israeli snipers or have been targeted by strikes. This sort of thing has happened before and tragically killed 7 aid workers earlier this week.
We're told that Israel is meant to have some of the most sophisticated defence systems and defence forces on the planet. What does this tragedy say to that to you, Greg?
I think it tells you how loose the rules of engagement are in Gaza. I mean, what we know about this incident is that it wasn't just one strike. It was 3 missiles fired by a drone that targeted the 3 cars in this convoy, one after the other in succession. And the people who were piloting the drone could have seen wounded people being evacuated from one car, moved into another one, nonetheless targeted that second car and then that third car. And this is what we've seen more broadly over the past 6 months is very low rules of engagement around trying to protect civilians, differentiate between civilians and combatants. That is why the death toll in Gaza is so catastrophically high, why more than 32,000 Palestinians have been killed.
Condemnation is ringing around the globe. How concerned will Netanyahu or the Israeli administration be?
I'm not sure about Netanyahu himself, but there are certainly many voices in the Israeli military and the security establishment who are worried about this. You already had a situation where even Israel's allies around the world were losing patience with its conduct of the war, with its refusal to take steps directly to bring more humanitarian aid into Gaza, with the civilian death toll and these growing reports of famine and hunger in Gaza. And now if you look at the nationalities of these aid workers who were killed, you have 3 Brits, 1 Australian, 1 American, Canadian, dual citizen. These are people who come from countries that have been staunch supporters of Israel, and they've now had their own citizens killed in what seems like a totally unjustifiable drone strike. And that's going to add even more strain to these already strained relationships.
Lastly, how secure politically is Benjamin Netanyahu?
He's not secure once an election is called, but the question is when that election is going to be called. You look at the polls, and this is not just now, this is any point in the past 6 months. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of Israelis want him to resign. There is broad agreement that the prime minister needs to go, and Benny Gantz, the centrist former army chief who sits in the war cabinet, looks like the odds-on favorite to become the next prime minister. The issue is, to get to an early election, the Knesset, the parliament, needs to pass a no-confidence motion. And for that to happen, the opposition needs to pick off 5 members of the governing coalition, get them to vote for that no-confidence motion. And these coalition members, they can read the polls as well as anyone else. They know that if there is an early election, they are likely to lose that election and wind up out of power. And that has given them an incentive to hold together. And so despite the widespread public disgust with this government, the members of that government have good reason not to dissolve it and call for an election. Until that happens, Netanyahu remains prime minister.
Enjoyed our conversation, Greg. Thank you. Greg Karlstrom is Middle East correspondent for The Economist. He was joining us from Dubai. So, as well as the idea of suspending, not completely halting, but temporarily suspending arms sales, bear in mind it could have been our missiles that killed those British men, and indeed the Pole, and the dual national, the Palestinian, as well as everybody else. Do you support that? Do you know anyone who's actually been brave enough to deliver or try to deliver aid to Gaza, to work for one of these charities that we've mentioned? Or someone who's been commendable enough to try and sign up to do that? We'll take your views on that.